The house had been silent for weeks, yet somehow it still breathed. When Lila unlocked the front door that afternoon, the air met her like a memory she wasn't ready to face. Dust drifted through the sunlight in lazy spirals. Every surface seemed to whisper her grandmother's name. Evelyn's scent lingered in the air, faint jasmine and old books, the kind of smell that makes you stop mid-step because your heart remembers before your mind does. Lila had promised herself she would just gather a few things, pack the photos, and leave. But grief never follows plans. It makes you notice the smallest things, like the indent on the pillow where her grandmother's head used to rest, or the cup still sitting by the window, a thin line of dried tea around the rim. She moved slowly through the room, careful not to disturb anything. On the nightstand sat a small wooden box covered by a piece of lace. The pattern had yellowed with time. When she lifted the cloth, a quiet shiver ran down her spine. The box was beautiful in an old-fashioned way, oak with brass edges, a tiny crank on the side, and a single sentence carved across the lid. "Play this when you miss me." Lila brushed the dust from the words. She remembered her grandmother's voice the last time she mentioned the box. "Not everything needs to play again," she had said, closing it gently as if protecting something fragile. Lila hadn't asked what she meant. Some things between them were better left soft and unfinished. Now, standing alone in the fading light, she turned the crank. The handle resisted. She tried again. A dry click broke the silence, but no melody followed. For a moment, disappointment tightened her throat. It felt almost symbolic. Even her grandmother's music had chosen silence. She set the box back down, unsure why her chest ached as if she had lost her all over again. Outside, the sky was sliding toward dusk. The clock on the dresser ticked too loudly, filling the emptiness that the music should have claimed. Lila sat on the edge of the bed, the box resting beside her hand. Maybe, she thought, it was never meant to play again. But something about the weight of it felt wrong, as if the silence itself was holding its breath. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet certainty began to stir. This was not the end of her grandmother's song. If this story touched your heart, remember to like, share, and subscribe to Voice of Lila's, where memories whisper and hearts remember. The next morning, the air inside the house was cooler. The curtains hung still, untouched by the faint breeze outside. Lila sat at the edge of the bed again, staring at the music box like it was a riddle her grandmother had left for her. The brass crank gleamed faintly in the morning light, as if mocking her curiosity. She tried once more. The handle turned half a circle, then jammed. A hollow click echoed through the room and died. She tilted the box, shook it gently, pressed her ear against its side. Nothing. The silence had a strange weight, like it was trying to say something without words. She turned the box over and noticed something she had missed before, a small engraving at the bottom. The year 1944, faint and shallow, almost worn away by time. It was the year her grandparents met. Her heart skipped. She brushed the edge with her thumb and whispered to herself, maybe this was his gift to her. On the dresser beside her, an old photo album lay open. Her grandmother's handwriting curved across the first page, careful and elegant. Lila flipped through the photographs, half hoping to find some clue about the box. She stopped at a picture she didn't remember seeing before. It showed Evelyn standing next to a man in a military uniform, smiling softly. He wasn't her grandfather. The caption beneath the photograph read only one letter, M. She frowned. There had never been any mention of an M. Her grandfather's name was Henry, and she had seen hundreds of pictures of them together. But this man's eyes looked different, not in the way of a stranger, but of someone who once mattered. That night, the house refused to sleep. The wind slipped through the cracks of the old window, making the curtains sway. Lila lay awake listening, the music box resting on the nightstand beside her. Every tick of the clock felt louder than the last. She closed her eyes, trying to remember the sound of her grandmother's laughter or the way she hummed while watering her plants. Somewhere between sleep and memory, Lila thought she heard something faint, a thin, wavering tune drifting from across the room. Her eyes opened. The house was still. The music box hadn't moved. But for a moment, she could have sworn she heard a melody, gentle, fragile, like someone was winding it in another time. When the sound faded, she sat up, heart pounding. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. The following morning, Lila decided she needed answers. She packed the music box carefully into her bag, wrapping it in a scarf, as if it were something alive. The town was still quiet when she stepped outside. Leaves drifted along the sidewalk, the early light cutting through the fog like thin ribbons. She hadn't been back to the main street in years, not since she was a child holding her grandmother's hand. At the corner of Willow Street stood a narrow shop with faded gold lettering on the window, Montgomery Watch Repair. The bell above the door chimed softly when she entered, the sound sharp and clear after the stillness of the house. The man behind the counter looked as old as the shop itself. He wore thick glasses and had steady hands, the kind that seemed built for small miracles. When Lila placed the box in front of him, his expression changed. He ran his fingers gently over the wood, tracing the carvings. "This belonged to Evelyn, didn't it?" he said, not really asking. Lila nodded, her voice too soft to answer. "She used to bring it here every year," he continued. "Said it was her good luck charm. I offered to fix it once, but she refused. Told me some songs should stay silent." Lila felt a chill crawl up her spine. That was exactly what her grandmother had said. She watched as the man reached for his small screwdriver, his movements slow and careful. He lifted the back panel and peered inside. The tiny gears were rusted, the springs wound tight but unmoving. Then he frowned. "There's something stuck in here," he murmured. He picked out a thin, folded scrap of paper wedged between the cogs. Time had turned it the color of tea. Lila's pulse quickened. "What is it?" she asked. He handed it to her with a look of quiet curiosity. She unfolded it carefully, the paper fragile against her fingertips. The ink had bled over the years, but the words were still clear enough to read. "If you ever hear this again, I found the letter. M." The silence that followed felt different now, thicker somehow. The old man looked at her and said softly, "That's not her handwriting, is it?" Lila shook her head. "No." For a long moment, neither spoke. The music box sat between them, its crank catching the morning light, its song still trapped inside. As she left the shop, the note burned in her pocket. Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering dry leaves across the street. The sky was turning the same gray-blue color as the photo she had found. Who was M, she wondered, and what letter had he found? The note stayed in Lila's pocket the whole walk home. She could feel it each time she took a breath, light as air but impossible to ignore. When she entered the house, the air felt different, heavier somehow, like the walls were listening. She placed the music box on the table and unfolded the note again. The handwriting was neat but slightly uneven, the kind of script men used when writing from the field. Her eyes lingered on the last part. "I found the letter." Which letter? And who was M? She went to the room that had always smelled like lavender and dust, the one that used to be her grandmother's study. The drawers were neatly arranged, every paper stacked, every book aligned. Evelyn had lived her life with the precision of someone afraid to forget. Inside the bottom drawer, beneath old postcards and unused envelopes, she found a small wooden tray filled with sealed letters. Most were addressed to family and friends, some with yellowed edges, others still crisp. She went through them slowly until one caught her eye, a thin envelope, the paper brittle, the ink faded to brown. It was addressed to Evelyn Montgomery, Boston, 1945. The sender's name written across the top, in a hand that made her heart stutter, Lieutenant Henry Montgomery. Her grandfather. Lila froze. Her pulse drummed in her ears. The letter had never been opened. The seal was still intact, worn smooth by time. For years, her grandmother had kept this hidden. Why would she never open a letter from her own husband? She sat on the floor, the envelope trembling in her hands. The handwriting was clean and precise, like someone who still believed in order even when the world around him was chaos. The note from M echoed in her mind, "If you ever hear this again, I found the letter." Had M been the one who discovered it years later? Or had he written this for her grandmother after finding the letter himself? The thought tangled her stomach. She lifted her eyes to the photo on the desk, her grandmother standing beside the unknown man in uniform. The caption beneath read simply, M. She whispered it aloud, Michael. It felt strange to say his name in the quiet house, like speaking it made something shift in the air. Maybe he was the one who carried the letter back after the war. Maybe he never gave it to her. Or maybe he did, and she couldn't bear to read it. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Lila folded the letter against her chest, unsure whether she had just uncovered a mystery or reopened a wound. Either way, she knew one thing for certain. The silence around her grandmother's song was no longer simple. It was guarding something that had waited 70 years to be heard. Rain came overnight, steady and soft, tapping against the windows like fingertips. Lila sat at the kitchen table with the unopened letter lying beside her teacup. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the name on the envelope floated behind them. Henry Montgomery, her grandfather. But the face that haunted her was not his. It was the man in the photograph with her grandmother, the one marked only with an M. His expression was calm but guarded, the kind of look soldiers wore when they had already seen too much. When the rain lightened, Lila went to the attic. Boxes towered around her, stacked in uneven rows. Each was labeled in Evelyn's careful handwriting. Christmas ornaments, family albums, Henry's belongings. She hesitated at the last one, then opened it. Inside were medals, faded ribbons, a map of France folded along the creases, and a small stack of letters tied together with twine. The top letter was addressed to Henry, not from him. The return name was Michael Turner. Lila unfolded the paper. The ink had bled, but one line was clear. I promised her I would bring it home. If I make it back, she deserves to know the truth. Her throat tightened. So Michael was real. He had served with Henry. He was the one who brought the letter back to Evelyn after Henry died. But if that was true, why the note in the music box? Why say, I found the letter? She looked through the rest of the box. Near the bottom, she found a small photograph of her grandmother sitting on a park bench. The back read simply, 1946, Munich. The same year the war ended, the same year the music box had been made. Lila sat back on her heels, piecing together fragments of two lives she never really knew. Maybe Michael had carried the last words of her grandfather across the ocean. Maybe he had fallen in love with Evelyn while doing it. Maybe the music box was his way of giving her a piece of Henry that still lived. In her grandmother's journal, hidden inside a stack of recipe cards, she found a single page written in that same familiar looping script. He said the song was Henry's gift. I couldn't bear to hear it." Lila read it 3 times before the meaning sank in. The melody was Henry's, finished by Michael, gifted to Evelyn as a final memory. But to her grandmother, the song was not comfort. It was loss made permanent. She looked at the unopened letter again, her hands trembling. If her grandmother could never bring herself to read it, maybe Lila was meant to. Maybe that was what the silence had been waiting for all this time. The music box sat on the counter, dull in the gray light. For the first time, she noticed the crank seemed looser, as if it too was waiting for her to begin. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world washed clean and quiet. Lila sat in the living room, surrounded by boxes, the unopened letter on her lap. Her hands hovered above the seal, trembling. She wanted to open it, to finally know what her grandmother couldn't face. But another part of her hesitated, as if doing so might betray Evelyn's silence. She unfolded her grandmother's journal again and flipped to the same entry she had read the night before. The ink had faded, but the words were steady. "He said the song was Henry's gift. I couldn't bear to hear it." Beneath it, another line she hadn't noticed before. "When I stopped the music, I thought I could stop the ache, but silence has its own sound." Lila read it aloud, her voice breaking halfway through. She imagined Evelyn sitting at the same table decades ago, the music aux beside her, hands shaking the same way. The silence her grandmother had chosen was not peace, it was protection. The letter in her lap suddenly felt heavier. She turned it over, tracing the seal again. Maybe Evelyn had wanted to believe Henry would come home. Maybe reading his last words meant accepting that he never would. Lila's phone buzzed with a message from her mother, checking if she was still at the house. She typed back a simple yes, then set the phone aside. Some truths were not meant to be shared yet. She stood, crossed the room, and placed the letter on the mantelpiece beside a photograph of Evelyn and Henry from their wedding day. They looked impossibly young. Their smiles still carried the light of people who believed time would wait for them. Then she picked up the music box. Its weight felt different now, less like an object, more like a heartbeat. She turned the crank slightly, and the mechanism groaned. It wanted to move, but couldn't. She stopped, afraid of breaking it, afraid of ending the silence her grandmother had guarded for 70 years. The house creaked softly, the floorboards sighing under her feet. She could almost hear Evelyn's voice, the way she used to hum while cooking, the sound blending with the ticking of the old wall clock. Lila whispered, "I think I understand now. You didn't stop the music because you stopped loving him. You stopped because you loved him too much." Her reflection in the window looked older than she remembered. The sky outside was pale and still, like it was holding its breath. She set the music box down and exhaled slowly. "Not yet," she murmured, "but soon." Because deep down, she knew that when she finally wound the box, the sound that came out would not just belong to Henry or Evelyn anymore. It would belong to her too. That night, the house was wrapped in silver moonlight. The rain had stopped hours ago, leaving only the rhythmic drip from the gutter outside. Lila couldn't sleep. The unopened letter rested on the nightstand, the music box beside it. 2 unfinished stories waiting to speak. She reached for the box first. Her fingers hesitated above the crank. The brass was cold, worn smooth by years of her grandmother's touch. She could almost see Evelyn sitting in this same spot decades ago, her hand hovering exactly like this. A whisper of wind slid through the open window, rustling the curtains. The air carried the faint smell of jasmine, that same scent her grandmother always wore. Lila smiled through the lump in her throat. It almost felt like a sign. She turned the crank. Once, twice. It resisted, then gave in with a soft click. The gears inside began to move, creaking, trembling as if waking from a long dream. And then the first note. It was slow, unsure at first, then steady. A delicate melody filled the room, tender and haunting, a lullaby made of longing. Lila's breath caught. Every note seemed to carry a memory she didn't know she still had. Her grandmother humming in the kitchen, her grandfather's framed photograph in the hallway, the warmth of stories told by lamplight. She closed her eyes and let the song play. In that fragile music, she could almost see them. Henry in his uniform, Evelyn waiting by the window, the letter still unopened in her hands. Time folded in on itself, and for one heartbeat, all 3 generations existed together in that room. Tears welled in her eyes. The melody rose, a little stronger now, as if it had waited all these years just to be heard again. She whispered, "Thank you, Grandma." The song reached its final verse, a quiet repetition of the first few notes, and then faded into silence. But this silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything the music had set free. Lila looked at the letter again. For the first time, she didn't feel afraid to open it. Whatever it said, whatever truth it carried, she could face it now, because the song had already told her what mattered. Love does not vanish. It waits, quietly, until someone dares to listen again. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees, carrying the last trace of the melody into the night. Lila sat very still, hands folded over her heart, knowing she had just done something her grandmother never could. She had set the music free. Morning light crept through the curtains, soft and golden. The world outside felt new again, like even the air had been rewound overnight. Lila sat by the window with a cup of tea, her sketchbook open on her lap. The music box rested on the table beside her, silent now, but somehow more alive than ever. She hadn't opened the letter yet. It still sat on the mantelpiece, untouched. She wasn't avoiding it anymore. She simply didn't need it to know how the story ended. The melody had already told her everything her grandparents had meant to say. For the first time in months, she began to draw. Her pencil moved easily, guided more by feeling than thought. She drew her grandmother as she remembered her, standing by the window, light spilling over her shoulders, the music box in her hands. In the drawing, the lid was open, and instead of notes, tiny paper birds floated out into the air, flying toward the sun. She smiled. That was the ending her grandmother deserved. When she finished, she scanned the sketch into her computer and added color, soft browns, pale gold, a hint of rose in the light. The artwork would become the cover of her next book, a quiet story about memory and the courage to listen. She titled it, "The Things We Never Played Again." Later that afternoon, Lila recorded the sound of the music box. It took a few tries to capture it clearly. The melody was faint but pure, trembling like a whisper in an empty room. She layered it at the end of her video, letting it fade slowly beneath her voice. She pressed record and spoke softly. "This is Voice of Lila's," she said. "This is for the songs our loved ones never played again, the ones we find when we are ready to listen." She paused, her gaze lingering on the music box, the one her grandmother had never dared to wind. She continued, "Sometimes the hardest part of love isn't saying goodbye. It's finding the courage to let it play one more time." When she finished, she set the microphone down and let the final notes play out. The song filled the room once more, clear and complete this time, no longer trapped by grief or fear. Lila closed her eyes, feeling her grandmother near, not as a ghost, but as a presence, steady, gentle, at peace. The box clicked to a stop. Silence followed, but it was a silence that finally felt kind. On the screen, her recording ended. the last frame showed the music box under the soft afternoon light. She whispered the final line, almost to herself. She never wound it again, but I did, and maybe that was all she ever wanted. Then she pressed upload, and the story of their song, their silence, their love found its way back into the world. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still remembers their own melody. Subscribe to Voice of Lila's, where memories whisper and hearts remember. Weeks passed, but the melody never really left her. Sometimes Lila would wake before dawn and hear it again, not from the music box, but from inside her memory, the gentle rhythm of forgiveness set to the sound of time itself. Her mother visited one afternoon and found the box sitting on the shelf beside Lila's framed sketch. The birds in the picture seemed almost to move in the light. Her mother ran her hand along the edge of the frame, smiling softly. "Your grandmother would have loved this," she said. Lila nodded. "I think she already does." She didn't tell her mother about the letter still sealed on the mantle. It would stay there, just as it was. Some words are meant to remain between the people who wrote them and the air that carried them. The music box had become more than a relic now. It was a reminder that silence could hold love just as deeply as sound, that every pause, every stillness carried meaning if you listened closely enough. She sometimes played the recording at night while she worked on new drawings. The melody always seemed to change a little, as if it was still alive, reshaping itself to fit whatever her heart needed to hear. On the anniversary of Evelyn's passing, Lila walked to the small lake behind the house. The water was still, mirroring the pale sky. She brought the music box with her and wound it once. The song rose quietly, each note echoing across the water. For a long moment, she listened, not to the past, not to the ache, but to the simple truth that love survives in the spaces between. She whispered, "Thank you for leaving it for me." Then she smiled and let the melody play to its final note. When it stopped, she closed the lid gently and whispered the same words Evelyn once did. "Not everything needs to play again." But this time, she said it with peace. As she walked back toward the house, the sky opened into evening. The faintest hum of the song followed her, carried by the wind through the trees, soft and endless, the sound of a life that had finally learned how to keep playing. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still listens for the music left behind. Subscribe to Voice of Lila's, where every memory finds its voice again.